This video is your gateway to the world of Path of Exile. I'll go over each major concept that you need for a working understanding of how to progress through the game. Path of Exile is complicated. There are rules built on rules with exceptions and caveats. This video is here to give you a foundation upon which to build your knowledge. Essentially, we'll go deep enough into the water so that you learn how to swim. The first thing we're met with when we go to load Path of Exile is choosing a character class. The character classes determine three major things. Number one, where you start on the passive tree. Number two, what your options are for your Ascendancy classes, which are essentially specialized passive points, and which skill gems the vendors will offer you along the way throughout the campaign. Around the halfway point through the campaign, you get access to complete a quest where you can buy all the skill gems, no matter what class you are. But it still does matter what class you are at the start, because it determines which skill gems you have access to for leveling up to that point. Unlike a lot of RPGs, the correlation between what a character class is and what they're able to do is pretty weak. What I mean by that is you can have a ranger spellcaster, you can have a melee witch, a ranged Templar. Builds are far more limited by the creator's imagination and understanding of game mechanics than it is by the character class. If this is your first time playing Path of Exile, you won't have the Scion class unlocked at the very start. You'll have to rescue her in Act 3, and once you do this one time, you will never have to rescue her again. Earlier I mentioned Ascendancy passives, so these are passive points that match up with archetypes that we would expect. So for example, with the Witch, her Ascendancy classes are the Elementalist, the Occultist, and the Necromancer. As of this video, as you're going through the campaign, you need to unlock Trials of Ascendancy in order to access a zone called the Labyrinth. Completing the Labyrinth will allow you to specialize into one of your Ascendancies, and then allot you 2 passive points to put into that special Ascendancy passive tree. Now this is a lot of information, but I want you to take away from this the fact that each character has 3 Ascendancy classes, and these classes are tied to the character. You can also only have 1 Ascendancy active at a time. So the Witch has Elementalist, Necromancer, and Occultist Ascendancy classes. She can only have 1 of these active at any given time. This is true for all character classes except for the Scion. The Scion is allowed to pick 2 minor versions of each Ascendancy of her choosing, instead of picking 1 in particular. I want you to check the video description for more information about the Trials of Ascendancy and Labyrinth. Let's talk about skill gems. So skill gems are how you perform attacks or spells within Path of Exile. To be able to use a skill, you have to socket that skill gem into a corresponding color on a piece of gear that you're wearing. So for example, a blue skill gem, like this fireball, has to be socketed into a blue socket on one of your gear pieces. Once socketed, a skill gem will gain experience just like you do and level up. There are 3 main types of gems that you're going to come across. That is attack gems, spell gems, and support gems. For attack gems, you'll notice there's a line here that says deals X percentage of base attack damage. This means that in addition to any other effects that the attack gem has, it's going to look at the base attack damage range of your weapon that's currently equipped. So because attack gems have this line on them that says they deal percent of your base attack damage, that means that upgrading your weapons periodically is going to be important. Now for spell gems, by and large the rule is that they were going to have their own minimum and maximum damage associated with the spell. This means that they don't rely specifically on a weapon's damage output in order to increase their damage. They increase their damage by leveling up. So because we're usually not going to be reliant on the weapon's attack damage, we are looking for weapons or shields that have increased spell damage or increased elemental damage of a certain type, like increased fire damage, or adds a number to number flat damage to spells. These kinds of modifiers will affect your spell damage output. And if you ever wonder what kinds of damage increases are going to affect the spell you're using, if you hover over the spell gem itself, you're going to notice these tags up here at the top. These will let you know what kinds of modifiers are going to affect this spell gem. Now our third variation are support gems. Typically either alter the mechanics of an ability by either giving them more projectiles or they straight up increase the damage output of the affected skill. This is accomplished by finding gear that has multiple sockets that are linked together. As you can see here, this is what a link looks like. And so if you put a skill gem like Fireball in this slot, and then you put a support gem into this linked slot, Fireball is now supported by this gem. This is the primary way that you upgrade damage output of your skills. It's worth noting here that one-hand weapons and shields can have up to 3 sockets. Gloves, boots, and helms can have up to 4 sockets, and two-hand weapons and armor can have up to 6. However, this doesn't mean that any two-hand weapon that you drop in Act 1 can have up to 6 sockets. There's something in Path of Exile called item level. Item level generally corresponds with the zone level, which you can see here by hitting tab in the upper right. The zone level is this, and so that is going to limit the item level of items that drop. This is important because the item level determines how many sockets an item can potentially have. There's a lot more that goes into item level and what it means for items in the game, but suffice it to say for right now, all you need to know is that the item level corresponds with the zone level of the monsters you're fighting, and that determines how many sockets an item can have, and it also determines the range of modifiers that the item itself can spawn with. Essentially, this means that stronger monsters can drop better items. So when we look at the passive tree as a whole, it can be kind of overwhelming. I mean, look at this monstrosity. It's huge. How do I decide where to go? First, let's take a look at some completed builds that are just going to fade in and out behind me. What I want you to notice, without knowing necessarily anything about the tree, is that the trees will generally expand from your starting position area into adjacent sections of the tree. So for example, a witch is unlikely to travel to the very south end of the tree, just as a duelist is unlikely to travel to the very north of the tree. While the passive tree is an enormous entity of potential, we only have so many passive points that we get to use to travel through it, so we have to prioritize. Now let's break down what these nodes are and what they mean to us as the player. First up, these little guys are called small passives, and they are either travel nodes, as in nodes we have to pick up in order to travel to other sections of the tree, or if they belong in one of these little clusters, then they are a notables small passive. Small passives that belong to a notable cluster are different in that they don't generally just give you stat bonuses, instead they give you portions of whatever bonus the notable gives you. So for example, with this notable cluster of life nodes, you'll see the small passives are giving percent life leading up to the notable, which gives you much more for investing that many passive points into that cluster. And I kind of just covered this, but the notables are just stronger versions of their associated small passives. Small passives and notables are going to make up the majority of the points that you spend on the passive tree. However, there are these larger nodes called Keystones. These keystone nodes alter fundamental mechanics of the game and how they interact with your character. Typically, there is some kind of trade-off for the power that they give. Something I'd like to note about the keystone passives is that there isn't necessarily good or bad keystones. At least that's the design that Grinding Gear tries to go for. All of them are supposed to be good or bad depending on how a build makes use of them. Sometimes there are going to be keystones that are just straight up too good to be true, and usually they get nerfed, because Grinding Gear likes to have this trade-off balance where you have to think twice or maybe 3 times about whether you really want to take this keystone. And also, in case you're wondering, there's no limit on how many keystone passives you can take. Now you're also going to see these on your passive trees for build guides. These are called cluster jewels, and they have their own unique list of notables and small passives. Cluster jewels have a very high potential to be powerful and can only be socketed at these specific sections on the passive tree. For the purposes of this video here, I just want you to understand that they exist. They are potentially very powerful, but you also trade off being able to access the rest of the normal tree because you do spend a fair amount of passives to activate a full cluster jewels notables. Path of Exile's currency system is barter-based. Each of these kinds of currencies can be used on items within the game to alter those items. There isn't a type of currency within Path of Exile whose only purpose is to be currency, like gold in Diablo, for example. Its only purpose is to be gold. Within each town, there is a vendor that has a static set of select currencies for sale. As we hover over these currencies, we can see that X amount of one currency allows us to buy another kind. For example, 4 Jeweler's Orbs are equal to 1 Orb of Fusing. So long as we have 4 Jewelers, we can buy 1 Fusing from the vendor as much as we want. As you can see, Path of Exile is built on this kind of a barter system, which serves to help build a hierarchy of value for the different currency types. Over time, you'll get used to this hierarchy and start to understand which orbs are worth approximately how much, but understand that if you're going to play in the seasonal leagues, which a high majority of players do, these hierarchies might get disrupted based on certain league mechanics. It's not really a problem or something you really need to pay too much attention to right now in the context of this video. I just want you to be aware that it can happen. Just because a vendor says 4 Jewelers are worth 1 Fusing, that's not necessarily what the market of players are going to say. Now let's go over a couple of these currencies specifically and talk about some of the information that you might need to know before using them. Chromatic orbs re-rolled the socket colors of a piece of gear. Which colors are more likely to come up are based solely on what attributes the item requires. So if you have a piece of armor that only requires strength to use it, it's going to be weighted heavier towards red sockets than it will towards blue or green. If you have an item that requires both strength and dexterity to use, then both red and green sockets are going to have a higher and equal chance of rolling, while blue will have a lesser chance. Blue in this instance would be considered an off color. Jeweler's Orbs re-roll the number of sockets on an item. Here's a reminder on what items can have how many sockets. If you're using Jeweler's Orbs on an item and it has 20% quality, you're more likely to get more sockets the higher the quality is on an item. Quality is increased on armor by using armorer scraps, and on weapons by using blacksmith whetstones. The most common scenario where you'd want to use Jeweler's Orbs while leveling up is that you found a rare item that is a significant and direct upgrade from an item that you're currently using, and there is no other place on your gear that you can put those skill gems, so you must have the same number of sockets on that item. For fusing orbs, we're going to follow the same rules as Jeweler's Orbs, except we're trying to link sockets together. Now before we go over some of the other basic currencies, I want to talk about items and how they are made up of modifiers real quick to give you an understanding of what these orbs are going to do. Items in Path of Exile are made up of prefixes and suffixes. A blue item, which is also referred to as a magic item, can only have up to 1 prefix and 1 suffix. Rare items, which are yellow, can have up to 6 modifiers total, 3 prefixes and 3 suffixes. That's all we need to know about prefixes and suffixes for right now. For the Orb of Transmutation, we can turn a white item into a magic item, allowing it to have up to 1 prefix and 1 suffix. An Orb of Augmentation can be used on a magic item, and if that magic item only has a prefix or a suffix, it will add another modifier of the other type onto it. So if a magic item has a prefix modifier, an Orb of Augmentation will add a suffix. An Orb of Alteration will roll the 2 modifiers that a magic item has on it. It could give 1 prefix, 1 suffix, or both. A Scouring Orb can be used on a magic or rare item to turn it back into a white item with no modifiers. An Orb of Alchemy will take a white item and change it into a rare item, giving it up to 6 total modifiers. An Orb of Chance will take a white item and upgrade it either to a magic item, rare item, or unique item. Orbs of Regret we use to allow ourselves to respec our passive tree. While it only takes 1 point of regret to unspec 1 point on the passive tree, it takes 5 Orbs of Regret to unspec an Ascendancy passive. Chaos Orbs can be used on rare items, and they will re-roll that item, giving them up to 6 new modifiers. Chaos Orbs are the closest thing we have in the game to a standard currency. It's what most players want, and you can think of it this way: if the Chaos Orb is a $1 bill, then Exalted Orbs are $100 bills. Exalted Orbs add a new random modifier onto a rare item. They don't change any other modifiers, they simply will add a new random one. While you're leveling up through a seasonal league, you'll want to Acquire and trade Chaos Orbs as you're going to buy progression items like upgraded rare weapons or specific uniques that your build wants to use in order to level easier. However, if you find an Exalted Orb, you want to hang on to that because typically those will gain in value over the first 3 to 4 weeks of a league. As a new player specifically, I don't recommend using an Exalted Orb under any circumstance. Exalted Orbs are used primarily in the crafting system, which is rather complicated for this video to cover. Because of this, it's almost, no, not almost, it's always going to be in your best interest to trade Exalted Orbs for items that you need. Now, despite it being the absolute rarest currency in the game to drop, if you do find a Mirror of Calandra, then you must hang on to it, as this item will only gain in value over the course of a league, and you'll want to find that sweet spot where you can sell it for hundreds of Exalted Orbs. And also, if you do find a Mirror of Calandra, place it in your inventory, go back to town, put it in your stash, and log out to force a save to the server to make sure that no rollback or server crashes cause you to lose that item. There are two primary forms of your health pool. One of them is your life, and the other is your energy shield. Energy shield protects your life pool, as in energy shield gets taken away first before damage goes to your life, except for chaos damage, which bypasses energy shield by default. You can gain life through modifiers on your gear that give plus flat life, as well as on your passive tree. You can get points that give you % increased maximum life. Energy shield is the same in that there are points on the passive tree that allow you to increase your maximum energy shield by 1%, but there's a caveat here in that energy shield also spawns on gear that requires intelligence to equip. This flat energy shield that you can get off of gear is then multiplied by the % increased energy shield that you get off your passive tree. Another note about energy shield itself is that if you haven't been damaged in the past 2 seconds, you will, by default, regenerate 20% of your maximum energy shield per second. This regeneration stops every time you get hit, and you do have to wait 2 seconds for it to start up again. And now, while it might sound like that's amazing for energy shield, please note that as a new player, you really should not be starting your character with energy shield as your focus. And one of those reasons is that it's really hard to both scale energy shield at low levels because the implicit amounts that you get from armor is really low. And you also can't use flasks to regenerate energy shield faster. So once you start taking damage with energy shield, and if you continue to take damage from a bunch of little hits, you will never regenerate. And this can be a problem because you have such a low amount of your total health pool. So I really recommend starting with life on essentially every character, even if you eventually plan to transition into energy shield. And that is as good a segue as any to talk about flasks. Flasks in Path of Exile serve an extremely important function both offensively and defensively. One of your primary flasks that you're going to want to keep an eye out for as you're leveling up are life flasks. As you level up, you'll gain access to stronger and stronger life flasks that both recover hit points faster as well as recover more total hit points. The way flasks work is when you equip them, they are considered active and they can gain charges. When you use a flask, as you can see here, you'll use a certain amount of charges on every use. When you kill monsters or deal damage to boss monsters, you will gain charges back for your flasks. Beyond the standard 3 flasks that you would expect, which are life, mana, and life and mana hybrid flasks, there are a slew of utility flasks as well as unique flasks that have their own set of rules and modifiers that they give to you. Check below for a link in the video description on more information about these flasks. Alright, let's talk about elemental resistances. This is super important. This is a fundamental pillar of your defense in Path of Exile. The game is literally balanced around you having a capped amount of elemental resistances, which is 75%. You'll see here on the character defensive sheet tab that there are 4 resistances listed. There's fire, lightning, cold, and chaos. Chaos is not considered to be an elemental resistance. It is its own resistance. So if you see an item that says plus all elemental resistances, you are not getting chaos resist out of that item. While you're leveling through the campaign, you can get away with having between 30 and 50% resistances for the first 4 acts, but once you get past Act 5 and then closer to Act 10, you really want to make sure that you have as high as you can of resistances, close to 75%, if not hitting 75% on all of your elemental resistances. And once you beat the campaign and get into maps, which is our endgame progression, you must have at least 70% of all your elemental resistances, but really you should have 75 for everything. This is because once you beat the campaign, when you start dying after that point, you lose 10% of your experience in the level that you're currently in. You can't de-level, but this does make it extremely hard to progress your character if you're dying consistently. When it comes to chaos resistance and should you have it, should you not have it, as a newer player or just getting through the campaign, don't worry about getting chaos resistance. By the time you want to have non-negative chaos resistance for dealing with events that are balanced around that, you'll have had plenty of time to watch my other videos on that content to learn how much chaos resistance you need and how to deal with those attacks. Alright, let's talk about something called defensive layers. The first one we're going to talk about is Evasion. Evasion is a chance to completely negate the damage from an incoming ranged or melee attack. Evasion does not allow you to evade spells because spells automatically hit. The evasion system is balanced around something called an entropy counter. Whenever a monster or group of monsters land attacks on us, we get to roll the die of our evasion rating, right? So we roll that against their accuracy rating and we see who gets a hit and who evades. However, the enemy monsters also roll the entropy die on their side. This is a randomly rolled number between 0 and 99. Their goal is to get over 100. If they land a total score of 100, they hit. So that means if they roll an entropy die of 99 and their otherwise accuracy is a 1, they get a total score of 100 and they land a hit. Once they land that hit, they subtract 100 from their entropy counter and they go again. This ensures that there won't be long strings of either getting hit by attacks or evading attacks. So essentially what that means is if you get hit on the third attack from a monster, you will then continually get hit from the third attack by that monster. And now this doesn't last forever. This is reset every 3.3 seconds. So if you don't take a hit from that monster in 3.3 seconds, the entropy roll resets and that calculation starts over when they hit you next. So you might be wondering, after all of that, is Evasion a good defensive layer? It's pretty good. It takes a bit of investment to make it useful, but coupled with other defensive layers, it can be very strong. Armor is another defensive layer that is often misunderstood. Let's take a look at this cheat sheet taken from the wiki to help us understand why. There's 2 points on this that I think will illustrate it best. First is the very bottom point, which tells us armor will never prevent more damage than the total armor you have divided by 10. Now let's pair that with, to prevent half damage taken, you need 10 times the armor than the damage itself. What this tells us is that armor can be fairly significant against relatively smaller hits. Let's say you have a 5,000 hit point pool. You don't really care too much about 300 and 400 damage hits because you can react to this. You can hit a life flask, you can reposition with a movement skill, you can kill the thing that's hurting you. That's fine. The problem comes in when you deal with a 4,000 damage hit. In order to only take half of that damage, to only take a 2,000 damage hit, assuming that hit is pure physical, which it usually will not be, you need to have 40,000 armor. And as a new player, these numbers don't mean a whole lot to you because you don't have context, but trust me when I say having 40,000 armor is a significant investment. And as importantly, like I said, that damage probably is not going to be pure physical. Fortunately, there are other ways to build our physical damage reduction that doesn't require getting armor. So at this point in time, I can comfortably tell you that armor probably is not going to be worth investing into in large amounts. Let's talk about dodge. Unlike evasion, there is no entropy counter. You can continually dodge over and over and over, and there's also spell dodge. So you have attack dodge and spell dodge. Because of this, dodge is a very powerful defensive layer. There really are no drawbacks to it. Block is essentially on the same level as dodge in that it prevents all damage, and there is attack and spell block. As you might imagine, both of these defensive layers put together are very powerful, but it is relatively difficult in terms of how much investment you have to put in to achieve high block and dodge. It's worth noting that when you dual wield any two one-handed weapons, you automatically get 15% attack block. The campaign, or story mode, is a set of 10 acts that must be completed in order to unlock endgame progression, such as mapping and fragment bosses. You might have heard of bosses like Atziri and Elder and Shaper. These are what's known as fragment bosses. The campaign is made up of a series of quests. Some are mandatory to progress your quest state and finish the storyline. Others are effectively mandatory because they give you passive points for your skill tree, which you absolutely want to get. And others are truly optional in that they don't need to be completed for any reason. There's two exceptions to this quest rule. There's one quest in Act 3 that unlocks all of the other gems that could be bought from vendors from other character classes. This is Siosa in the library. And there's a quest in Act 5 that is the first quest you get upon getting there for Lily Roth, and she asks you to kill a couple monsters so you can buy any non-drop restricted gem in the game. Once you've completed the campaign, you'll gain access to the Atlas of Worlds. This is where you can run maps. There are multiple avenues of what's called endgame farming or endgame progression, but mapping connects all of it as a fundamental pillar. A map is an item that can be placed in your Atlas device. These map items themselves can be modified via currency, like we covered earlier, just like other items. What this does is makes the map more difficult for you to complete, but in exchange for that, it increases the monster pack size, meaning you get more monsters to kill, and it increases the quantity of items that they drop. Now, I mentioned the Atlas of Worlds. It's also known just as the Atlas. This is an entire progression system unto itself, where as you complete maps with the restrictions that it sets forth, you gain cumulative bonuses that increase the likelihood that you will drop higher tier maps and fragment boss maps. One of the primary goals of the Atlas is to get all 32 Watchstones, which reveals more maps to add to your map pool, and increases the tier of these maps, which in turn increases the level of the monsters. And remember, higher level monster means better potential rewards. Now, because there's just so much to cover with the Atlas, I'm going to instead link some videos that I've created that discuss the Atlas more in depth if you want to learn about it. You'll find these in the video description below. Build guides or figuring it out as you go, as well as solo self-found. These are all good questions that people have as to how they should go about progressing in Path of Exile. Let me present to you a scenario to help you figure this out for yourself. Let's say you're at Act 5 or 6, you're roughly halfway through the campaign, and suddenly you are either getting one shot or two shot, you're dying a lot, or you can't seem to kill monsters. Are you the kind of person who met with this question is going to say, all right, I want to dissect my character and my skills and see what I can add, if there's a curse or some kind of other debuff or other gems that I can put in to socket to my main skill and figure out what it is I need to do in order to progress? Or does everything that I just said stress you out internally just thinking about it? If this stresses you out, I would say go with a build guide. There's nothing wrong with following one of these to progress your first character or one of your first characters in a league or in your first time playing Path of Exile. Now, when you're looking for build guides in Path of Exile, there are some keywords and some key things to look out for to make sure that the guide is probably going to be a good one that will help you progress through to the end game. The first one is a keyword, League Starter. This is important because it denotes the fact that people who are creating these guides have a league start build in mind, which represents having lower currency and usually a lower character level before it comes online. Whether it be easy to obtain uniques or a specific character level that gives you a passive tree that really puts together a couple keystones or a bunch of notables, whatever the synergy is, it comes online faster and at a lower general cost. While you might come across guides that say they're a league starter but really aren't, I've found that most people try their best and are usually accurate when they describe their build as a league starter. Another thing that we want to look for in build guides is a leveling section. This usually includes at least a path of building excerpt of the passive tree that you can look at different levels like level 30, level 50, level 60 versions of the tree that can help give you an idea of how the build progresses on the passive tree, as well as usually an additional section that talks about what items you're going to want at certain levels and how many links you really want to have in your gear in order to start progressing quicker and easier. And don't worry, we'll talk about what a path of building is a little bit later in the video. Remember too, when you're reading a guide and specifically leveling gear, like they might point out a unique wand that they want you to have, remember that this isn't mandatory. It's more about just getting a wand or a bow or whatever weapon that you need with the kind of damage on it that you want. So maybe you want a bow with added flat elemental damages, or you want a wand that gives % increased fire damage. A rare item that has these same kinds of bonuses is going to work and get you through. The reason unique items are generally referenced as leveling items is because they're often fairly powerful when it comes to leveling when compared against their level requirement. Now, if you decide to forgo using a guide and build yourself a character, you must be willing and able to deal with the likelihood that you're going to run into a brick wall at least once during the campaign. Like I alluded to earlier in that example, you might start dying a lot. You might not be able to kill stuff as easily. If you want to and like figuring that kind of stuff out as to what you're doing wrong, then by all means go for it, but understand that Path of Exile is a complex game. And again, I don't want to overhype the idea of using guides or make it sound mandatory, but Path of Exile is not only complicated, it is punishing. You will lose 5% experience after Act 5, and once you complete Act 10, you'll lose 10% experience when you die. You can't de-level, but this can stop you from leveling. And to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying that you can't figure it out and that Path of Exile is too complicated to figure out on your own. I just want you to make sure that you know how you find enjoyment in the game that you're playing, because Path of Exile can go from really fun to really sour if you put yourself into a position where your character gets kind of stuck. I want to touch on solo self-found real quick. If you are a newer player watching this video, don't play solo self-found. It is an objectively more difficult experience playing the game because the requirement of game knowledge and build knowledge is much higher for you to succeed. Progressing your character is currently balanced around being able to trade with other players. So when you take that away, you take away a lot of resources. And if you don't have the game and build knowledge needed to progress without them, then you're probably not going to have a good time. That said, you can turn off solo self-found on a character and go into the normal trade version of the league that you're in, whether it's hardcore or softcore. But you can't take a character that's in softcore or hardcore and bring them into solo self-found after they've been created. In this final section of the video, I'm going to go over some tips and smaller things that I couldn't quite fit into the other sections. So here we go. Things that you should know before playing Path of Exile. This right here is a program called Path of Building. This is what you'll see referred to very often in build guides or just around the Reddit or in general communications when you are looking to find the details of a build, or if someone wants to know how your build works in terms of the gear that it needs and the skills that it uses and the passive tree and all that. This is where those POB codes come from. Now this right here in this video is just to make you aware that it is a program that has all of this information. You can set up your skills, your items. It does a whole slew of calculations for your effective hit points and your damage output. This is the primary way people find actual real effective damage, because the tooltip in the game is notoriously bad because it does not calculate everything like Path of Building does. You'll find 2 links in the video description of guides that I've made on how to use Path of Building, and so if you're looking for more information, I would recommend starting there. Next up, this is a 2-part tip right here. This is the pathofexile.com/trade website. This will by default take you to whatever league is currently happening. Right now there's no league happening because we're right before Ultimatum on Friday, but you could find the league drop downs here, and you can search for items here. And as soon as you start typing, you'll see it starts auto-filling in whatever you're looking for. There are all of the stats that exist in the game here. So if you're looking for rare items with specific stats, you can find all of that here. And as you can scroll down here, there's all sorts of different variables that you can set depending on what it is, item category exactly, that you are looking for. It's also worth pointing out that there is bulk item exchange here. You can go through here and say, I want to buy Chaos Orbs, I have Exalted Orbs, and hit enter, and you will see what the current ratio is, more or less. There are price fixers, there are scammers, etc. Always be careful when doing trades and don't trade too quickly. You might be wondering, how do I list my items on the trade site? Well, these green tabs here are called premium stash tabs, and these are, as an aside, maybe the only thing that I would say is mandatory for anyone who's playing Path of Exile beyond the campaign mode would want to buy. What we can do with this tab is we can right click, we can call it whatever we want, and if we hit this little button called public, then we are allowed to price items individually, as you can see here, set a price on all items, or set an exact price. If you click one of these, you'll get an additional drop down over here, and you can set what currency you're looking to sell these items for. And if you do each item as individually priced and hit OK, then we could put in this flask, and I can right click on this item and say negotiable price or exact price, or don't index, don't put this on the trade site, and say I want 300 of these sextants for this item, whatever it is that you want to do. Now, while we're looking at these in particular, let's cover affinities. This is a relatively recent addition to the game, where even on normal tabs, it doesn't have to be a premium tab, you can set affinities for specific types of items. So like currency, or delve specific stuff, or essence, or all of these things that you can read here, unique items in particular. You can set specific tabs so that if you go here and hold Control and left click on an item, it is going to automatically go to wherever the affinity tab is. For example, in this one, my currency stash tab is the affinity tab for currency. So when I left click while holding Control any currency anywhere, it's going to automatically, as long as I'm connected to my stash here like I am here, it's going to go into this tab and auto sort itself. And finally, with these, we can also add folders. So we can create a folder, and we'll just call it t-test because I can't type. And then we can click and drag and put other tabs into here, and you'll see right here, it joins together. So I can bring this out and say, nope, I just want these remove only tabs because we're in standard, and that's what I'm going to do. And so now I have all of these tabs sitting underneath this folder. Now we have our hotbar down here of all of the skills that we're actively using. If we hold left Control, we bring up a secondary hotbar here, which is, as you can see here, Control Q, Control W, just Control, and then whatever the normal button is that you're using for these. And this is really good for just conditional spells that you might not use all the time, or especially for auras, which will be recast whenever you die, and you just don't want them taking up space on your normal hotbar where you're going to have active skills like Flame Dash and your attacks and all this other stuff that you're going to want easy access to. A couple more things on the hotbar itself. For our left click, it defaults when you start out to your default attack. You should immediately change this to move only so that when you are running around and clicking through monsters, you're not accidentally running up and trying to default attack them when you might be trying to move through them. This can and will absolutely get you killed. Additionally, for essentially any skill that you're going to be targeting on the screen, you want to click on it here, like for my Flame Dash, for my movement skill. I have up here, always attack without moving. So what you can do in this game is if you hold left shift and you try to attack, here I'll set this back to my default. If I hold left shift, I'm going to attack in place. What this button does is it assumes, without forcing you to actually hold the button, that you are holding shift, which means I can't teleport all the way over here, right? But it's going to act as though I'm holding shift and I cast in place. If I don't do this, for example, I will run up until that minimum point where I can travel that distance. This is another one of those little tricks that will save you quite a bit. Something I didn't really touch on in the rest of the video is curses and auras, and I'm going to expand this into generally what you're going to find in each act, so from the gem vendors. So in Act 1, you're going to get your basic lower level attack skills and spells, as well as some minor supports. In Act 2, you're going to get more stronger support skills, as well as some herald skills, which reserve parts of your mana, kind of like this is here. So it'll reserve a percentage and give you a buff that allows you to essentially deal more damage, which is great. And then in Act 3, you're going to start getting access to your auras, which are 35 to 50% mana reservation spells that are on all the time, kind of like this. And they are much more powerful than heralds. And you're also going to gain access to curses, which you can either cast on enemy creatures, and they're rather powerful, as well as marks and curses. These are separate but powerful debuffs. And for the curses, which are now called hexes in the game, you can set these as if they were an aura with a support gem called Blasphemy. And you'll run into these gems if you're totally unfamiliar with what I'm talking about. Don't stress about it too much. You will get access to these things as you move through the campaign. And then finally, in Act 4, you're going to get access to the potentially strongest support gems and some very powerful active gems, including your golem summons. When you find items that you might not necessarily want to keep at all, but you also don't think they're good enough to sell on the trade site, you can vendor them for shards of currency. So if you vendor unique items, you're going to get alteration shards and alchemy shards here. And as you get enough, you'll get full orbs back. And if you're just selling rare items, then if it has 6 modifiers, you'll get a Orb of Augmentation. Otherwise, you'll get a couple alchemy shards, a lesser rate than uniques, and alteration shards. And selling magic items or blue items will get you transmutation shards, alteration shards. And there is also a vendor recipe that is worthwhile with quality gems. So if you find enough quality gems, then you can add up to 40% total quality, and you'll get a Gem Cutter's Prism, which is an item that allows you to improve the quality of a gem. On the subject of vendor recipes, there's something called the Chaos Orb recipe. If you provide the vendor with a full equipment set of item level 60 to 74 rare items, they will give you 2 Chaos Orbs back, as we can see right here. Above item level 74, so anything above 75, and a set will give you Regal Orbs instead, which turn magic items into rare items. These are all unidentified rares, which gives you 2 Chaos Orbs. If you give a set of identified rares, then you get 1 Chaos Orb. To see the item level on your items, hold left Alt. Now you might have heard that you need item filters for Path of Exile. If you go to filterblade.xyz, you can download a filter that probably 99% of all people playing Path of Exile use. And what you can do is you can go here to the strictness level, you can set different preset settings, and click on the details here to have descriptions on what each means. And then you can scroll down and see what everything looks like and whether it's shown at all. If it has a strike through it, it hides the item when it drops, and you can get a sense of what the filter is going to do for items on the ground. A filter is really important. It helps you filter out all of the legitimately junk items that drop in Path of Exile. And once you have these settings set, you'll come up here to download, and here you can call it whatever you want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit download here. It will download to my downloads, and you're going to want to go to this location on your computer and put that there. And once we do that, we can go to our options, go to the UI tab, scroll down to the bottom, and we can scroll here, and we can find test filter right there. Click on that, hit save, it will say it's loaded successfully, and you're good to go. This right here is the Pantheon window. You'll gain Pantheons as you progress through the campaign. These are defensive passive buffs, and you can have one from this major god line up here, the big circles, and you can have one from the minor god line down here. You get the top line in blue here just by selecting it, so if I click on it there, you'll see the icon changed. I now have Soul of the Brine King, so if I get stunned, I can't get stunned again for 2 seconds, which is super helpful. And if I want those extra grayed out modifiers, then I'll have to figure out which map has that boss that it's referring to, and I will put a Divine Vessel in the map device with that map. Once I kill the boss, the Divine Vessel will get filled, the item itself, and I'll take that out of the map device, and I'll go to town where Sin is, the big guy with black wings, the black wing angel dude, and talk to him, and then he will, by you talking to him with the Divine Vessel, he will unlock that additional line. So for example, I've done this twice, so I have those 2 extra buffs. The Atlas also tells you where Divine Vessel bosses are. You can see this little icon here means there is Terror of the Infinite Drifts can be captured for the soul of Shikari. So the Atlas does tell you where the bosses are, so long as you can see the map on your Atlas. Okay, that was a bit rapid fire there at the end, but I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope if you're a new player or newer player, I helped ease you into some of the more complicated aspects of Path of Exile and what to expect. And if you want, hit the subscribe button. It's right there next to the thumbs down. Helps me out a lot. And until next time, this is Eli signing off.